years back, a little ways in time. To me, it seems like it was almost yesterday, but it was really 1981 in March. Ominous background sound for that day in March. It was when the mayor of Chicago, Jane Byrne, and her partner moved into a dismal housing project on the south side that was plagued with horrible living conditions, infested with cockroaches, and subject to continual gang violence. She said that she kept under a mosquito net at night so that she could keep the cockroaches from crawling over her body. She did this for 3 weeks. And then she moved back to her luxury penthouse in the Gold Coast rich neighborhood of Chicago. Her experiment did draw the attention of policymakers, and some things actually improved. Gang violence lessened for a while, for example. But social psychologists and the media were actually quite critical of what she had done and the way she talked about it. She was slumming it for a while. And then she got out of there and told stories about the experience along the lines of, "Oh, let me tell you about the time I lived like the poor." It seems like she walked a mile in their shoes, but not really, the critics said. And so did the psychologists, who are not quite as critical as the mainstream media. Because, they say, this is a situation that we call the toxic embodiment trap. A situation where quite literally one steps into another person's suffering, but it's temporary. It's not our suffering, it's their suffering. It turns out to be what we call a consumable experiment. Oh, one time I did this. It's something you can take on and then take off at your convenience. The Washington Post published an article about Mayor Byrne's experiment on April 9th, 1981, and you can still find it online. And the author of that article wrote, "Slumming won't teach what slum life is like." Like how many people in the projects have mosquito netting and have bodyguards hanging around. Even if someone who is well off in general is in dire straits for a while, so they are really suffering for a while, it's not the same as a lifetime of poverty. I sometimes recall a couple of weeks when my children and I had no money whatsoever, and we literally walked around town to pick up empty cans to redeem at the store, and then we could buy a loaf of cheap bread at the Schaefer factory. I remember it was 10 cents a loaf or something like that. And I used to take that bread and I put some margarine on it, and then some cinnamon sugar. I'd mix some cinnamon in with sugar, and I toasted it and called it cinnamon toast. Don't you love it? To this day, my son hates cinnamon. I call that episode our great adventure. We came out of it relatively unscathed, except for that cinnamon almost allergy. What would be a more real experience of walking a mile in someone else's shoes? Those same social scientists I mentioned in relation to the toxic embodiment trap explain that, ethically speaking, we cannot be fully empathetic unless we practice what is called relational empathy. That sounds good. We have to really be able to relate. How do we do that? Well, they say, Brené Brown has a lot of things to say about exactly this thing. But in general, two things are required. The first is that we practice deep listening without interruption. The second requirement is that we actually believe people's stories without projecting our own story into the narrative. When we have listened to people's stories, we should not place our own temporary slumming experience into the mix and diminish it by saying something insensitive like, let me tell you about the time when I was poor and lived off the pennies that we got from collecting soft drink cans. No, that's not the time to talk about that. The time to talk about that experience is when other well-off people also have temporary experiences, when we could sort of talk about that time when, but it's not our life. So here's another way of practicing relational empathy. It simply turns the situation upside down. Instead of well-off people trying to feel relational empathy by slumming it for a while and then talking about it in the news media, what we could do, individually and together as a society, if we can turn it into a society where people are lifted up out of those situations, where we all can do well, where everybody flourishes together. That's the topic we're tackling this month. Before giving a to-do list that we might think about, and some of you know exactly, or most of you know exactly what's on that to-do list, but I'll repeat it today in a little while. And before we do that, let me tell you about two types of societies that continually level out the wealth that people have, so that the rich continually become less rich and the poor become better off. I would like the world's first trillionaire to listen to this. The first is a biblical example. It's the example of the sabbatical year. You know, we still have sabbatical years that happen every 7 years in many cultural situations, like in academia. But in the Hebrew scriptures, there's a book called Deuteronomy. And in Deuteronomy, the sabbatical year is described. Deuteronomy is the fifth and the last book of what is called the Torah. And the Torah is the beginning of the Hebrew scriptures. They're quite lengthy. And it follows 4 other books: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. And in verse 15.2 of Deuteronomy, it says, I always use the New Revised Standard Version for my translations. And in that version, that verse says, quote, "And this is the manner of the remission. Every creditor shall remit the claim that is held against a neighbor, not exacting it of a neighbor who is a member of the community, because the Lord's remission has been proclaimed." That last thing means that God has already cancelled the debt, so don't go saying that it's not cancelled. Do it already. Deuteronomy, by the way, means restart. The sabbatical year cancels debts for a single year. And you may have heard that there is a distinction made between the neighbor and the person who's a member of a community. We may interpret that more generally as community. And most of us tend to do that. But the sabbatical year cancels debts for one single year. That's not bad. But in that same scripture, every 49 years, that is 7 times 7, there is a Jubilee year, and it's effective the 50th year, the year afterwards. And in the Jubilee year, the whole economy goes through a restart. Slaves are freed, and they can return to their families. Land goes back to its original owners. I have a little trouble with that part because the original owners might have committed genocide against some other peoples, but I'm going to leave that aside for today and focus on that some other time. So why the 49 years? Simply because in the grand scheme of things, everything belongs to God anyway. And in our times, if we take this idea forward and we give it our Unitarian Universalist interpretation, in our times, if we really believe in the interdependence of all things, especially all living things, we cannot permanently own things, let alone people. So that's my first example of a society where we always get rid of wealth and level the playing field. Closer to home in our times, in American indigenous cultures, the method of restoring and redistributing wealth is also very interesting. In many cultures, it is made clear that nature cannot belong to people, and that living and non-living things need to be respected equally. All things are alive. Rivers and waters usually have the pronoun she. To the Mojave people, for example, the Colorado River is a revered female life-giving being. Another dimension of this philosophy of life is the potlatch system. Potlatch literally means to give or a gift. The potlatch system is a system where a ceremony or a feast is organized regularly, in which the wealthy bring elaborate gifts like canoes, horses, maybe nowadays cars at work. It's practiced by several indigenous peoples, especially in the south, not in the southwest so much, but in the Pacific Northwest and in other places as well. And the host or the givers do not receive any money, but they get prestige. They get community recognition, appreciation. It's a major system of redistributing wealth. And thinking back about the meaning of relational empathy, it is a way of practicing exactly that, relational empathy and compassion. It's probably unrealistic to imagine the society that we live in to have such major and regular redistributions of wealth. But we can go in that direction. There is much that can be done and is being done in modern capitalist societies. So here comes my list. This is just a quick list. You'll find other things to put on it. My list has support of affordable health care for all, pay decent wages to those we employ. And when I say all, I don't just mean those that are considered by ICE as legitimate people in this country. All means all. The next one is equal pay for comparable work. Practice giving away what we don't need. Practice being an anti-racist. Practice more of the principle from those who have to those who need. Donate stuff we don't need. Use that Marie Kondo principle. If it doesn't spark joy, give it away. Progressive taxation. One of my favorites. Support publicly funded daycare, another favorite. Fund a scholarship for a disadvantaged young person. Volunteer in a soup kitchen or a shelter for the unhoused. Support labor unions, and so much more. Perhaps we can get inspired and find one or more of these ways to lessen inequality and increase fairness and equity in our own community. Perhaps we're already doing them. In either case, we may encourage others to do likewise. And may we make it so. For our closing hymn, let us rise in body or spirit and sing number 340.